Hello, everybody, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 7 of A Conversation with Cometan. Of course, I'm your host, Cometan, here today, and I'm coming to you with a brand new lecture. It's not going to be a very long lecture, I don't think, because it's only about 10 slides long, and it's covering a very specific aspect of the sort of Astronist sort of doctrine of salvation called transcension, and I've spoke about this many different times before, but I'm going to be kind of exploring a new aspect of transcension that I haven't really spoken about yet, primarily because I've been sort of writing about this aspect of transcension that in my brand new treatise, which is yet to be published, called the Astrodoxy. And so this is all kind of brand new, and it's something that I have been thinking about and working on for quite a while now, and I want to share it with the Astronist community and also people who are just interested in astronism, perhaps. So without further ado, let's get into this lecture on the ritual of the Surosia. Okay, so just a little bit of background to the sort of approach to ritual that we find in astronism. From the very beginnings of astronism, so kind of 10 years ago now, there was a very definitive aversion to ritual. And one of the reasons for this was that very early on in the development of astronism, I kind of saw ritual as not really holding much of a purpose or a function in astronism in the very early stages, primarily because I saw astronism then as purely a philosophy to be followed rather than as a religion per se, and sort of ritual is very much part of religious practice really rather than philosophical as much, or that's at least how I saw it anyway. Of course, there are sort of philosophies like Buddhism that have various different rituals, but you could say that they are more the religious side of Buddhism, for example. Anyway, I didn't really associate ritual much with sort of philosophy. And what I mean by ritual here is in terms of kind of a divine ritual, a kind of sacred ritual, rather than other kinds of rituals or practices that may not invoke that kind of divine element or that sacred element into it. So you can find in the Omnidoxy this kind of aversion to ritual from the Astronist perspective. You can find this throughout the Omnidoxy, and I do sort of even make a point to talk about non-ritualism or even anti-ritualism at some point. So I was quite harsh on the other side, I found, when I look back on my writings. I think it's because certainly I saw ritual to be outdated in a way. And again, like I said, you know, to have not much function in the Astronist philosophy and religion at that time, because at that time, the idea of scope hadn't really come to the forefront of Astronist ideas and philosophy, and certainly also the idea of transcension was still very in its formative stages. So I think that it's, in a way, because there's been this, well, I call it analipsocentric, because astronism has become very much focused on transcension as the salvific journey. There has been, from my perspective, a whole new perspective on ritual in astronism that has been taken, and so this has come to the fruition today and in the Astrodoxy of the ritual of the Surosia, which is the central ritual of astronism. And some other people as well, when I've been speaking about astronism, they've wanted to know, well, are there any rituals and things? And I've thought, well, not at that stage, no. But now I think it's time to perhaps introduce this kind of ritual on the basis now that I and sort of the Astronist community have a much better understanding of transcension and what is needed for transcension. And now at this stage, it feels right to kind of introduce some of the more ritualistic aspects of transcension. And this is what has produced Surosia. So like I've put there, it is important to remember that Astronism had not fully become analypsocentric by the time the Omnidoxy was being composed. So that was one of the reasons why in the Omnidoxy you will find this kind of aversion to ritual, because I didn't see it as having much function in Astronism. And as such, a ritual that would serve to support or progress transcension would be a ritual worthy of being practiced by Astronists. And this ritual, this chosen ritual, this sort of sidereine ritual, to use a term that I've used in a previous lecture this season, to use this sidereine ritual is called Surosia. Okay, so we're going to learn a little bit about Surosia today and what that actually means. Just to take a step back, I suppose, for a second. Of course, transcension is all about scope. It's all about trying to overcome limitation, okay? And if you've watched some of my previous videos, and especially the one on Astronism versus Christianity from earlier in this season, you'll get a really good understanding of the role of and perspective on salvation in Astronism and what that means to be saved. Okay, it's all to do with overcoming limitation. Limitation is seen as the first principle or first problem within Astronism that Astronism has to try to solve. And so scope and sort of accumulating scope within the individual person, but also manifesting scope in the world, is the way that we overcome limitation. Okay, so this scope, this complement, is something that we need to sort of accumulate, and scope is received from the divine, from God, through the astronomical world. I mean, I'm getting into sort of more of the philosophy here. I think it would be good if you guys take a look at the Astronism versus Christianity lecture before taking a look at this one, if you're not sure what scope is or how it works. I am going to be presuming that you do know what scope is and how it's used in Astronism. But the essential point is that we need scope. And so how do we get that scope? Well, we get it naturally through the astronomical world from the divine, and we get this sort of stream of scope coming down to us. Scope's all around us as well, so it is abundant around us. It is limited, though. It won't always be abundant and always be here. But then it got me to thinking about how we can invoke scope. How can we actually bring about scope in an active way, in a proactive way? And then I started thinking about the invocation of scope, okay, and what we can do to bring about scope. And this kind of led me to the Surosia, to think of a ritual that can be done to kind of commit ourselves to transcension, and in order to bring about more scope for humanity, both for us as individual human beings as well as for broader humanity, for the purpose of advancing transcension. So the Surosia's principal aim, the principal aim of this ritual, of this central Astronist ritual, is to invoke scope for human beings in order to advance transcension. And so with scope being the key resource for transcension, the more scope we possess, the closer we will be to completing transcension, okay? So on this basis, the Surosia serves a secondary function of guiding its practitioners in using their scope for the best possible outcome for transcension, which would often include the mastery of their astronality. So the ritual of the Surosia, its central function is to invoke scope, but its secondary function is also to guide human beings, particularly Astronists, of course, to use their scope in the best way possible. Okay, and of course, this is managed by the Astronist institution. These guidelines are put in place by the Astronist institution, that is obviously professing Astronism. And so, it's all about trying to harness this opportunity that we have, this scope that we have to overcome our limitations. And this is central to the process of transcension, okay? So invoking scope, receiving scope, and harnessing scope are the three different acts that are independent of each other. And so the fact that the first takes place does not necessitate the completion of the second and third, okay? And this is all due to cosmic limitations. So just because you invoke scope, so say you attend a Surosian service, for example, just because you are able to invoke that scope by attending that service does not mean that you'll necessarily sort of receive it, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to harness that scope and manifest it in the world for the benefit of transcension. These different stages are independent of each other, and they are also limited because we ourselves as the practitioners are also limited, okay? So there's this pervading law of cosmic limitation that pervades not only all of the cosmos but all of astronism as well. We always have to be aware when we're looking into astronism, when we're studying astronism, that there's this ever looming kind of law of cosmic limitation that places a limit on everything, and that includes all different aspects of astronism as well. So the point to make here is that each stage of scope, of invoking scope, receiving it, and harnessing it, we have to be strong. We have to have that goal of transcension in mind. We have to be able to overcome our limitations, okay? And at each stage, we will have this sort of internal kind of tendency to go towards limitation, to kind of regress transcension, to kind of, I would say, I suppose, indulge in our limitations. Procrastination would be one example of that, okay? So, and I know that a lot of people are procrastinators. So I myself have been, I'm sure I've procrastinated at some point in my life. We all have. That is our limitation element of us. That's that controversive nature of us, to remain limited. Okay. And so that is constantly kind of like pressing down on us, you know, as we're trying to receive this scope, to harness it. This limitation is constantly pushing us back, but it's not hopeless. It's not a hopeless situation. You know, we do have this scope, we do have this opportunity, and they are all there. We just need to keep on reminding ourselves. So the Surosia, a lot is about, as a ritual, is, yes, it's about scope, it's about invoking scope, it's about harnessing scope, being taught how to do that, how to harness it, but it's also about reminding us of our commitment to transcension. It's about this sort of ritual of recommitment, as I've put there. And this kind of, as we can see on the screen here, this kind of diagram is really helpful, and I call it the Surosian rhythm. It's helpful to understand, in understanding the Surosia and its functions in transcension, and specifically the economy of transcension. By the way, if you're not sure what that phrase means, go and take a look at one of the earlier lectures I did in this season. I think it was episode 3 on the economy of transcension. You'll probably get a better understanding of what I mean once you've sort of had a look at that lecture, if you're not sure. But the Surosian rhythm essentially shows us the different stages and functions of the Surosia, particularly in why it's necessary that this ritual be established, and why I found that this ritual needs to be established, okay, for the purposes of transcension. So we'll start with controversion, actually, because I think that understanding the controversion justifies why the Surosia needs to exist. So, of course, as I've just mentioned, we are all limited. We all have our limitations. We all procrastinate. We all hurt each other. We all suffer. We all die. We all are subject to immorality and wrongdoing. And this is encompassed by this concept of mine called the controversion. Okay, these are the distractions of the world. They lead to our aversion, procrastination, and controversive thinking about transcension, even to oppose transcension, to oppose the revelation of transcension. Okay, many people have done that throughout history, even before Astronism was founded. Really, the controversion is an aversion to cosmocentric thinking, really, in a broader sense, and because cosmocentric thinking leads to transcension. Okay, so we've got this aspect of ourselves, and this is pervading throughout the world because of and it serves to continue human limitation, and this is all because of the cosmic limitation that exists as a sort of intrinsic aspect of our cosmology of this reality that we live in. Okay, so we've got this aspect of the world, and so it can be difficult to kind of decipher scope. It can be difficult to determine, you know, if an opportunity is going to progress transcension or not. That can be kind of difficult to kind of interpret that, and it can also be difficult to kind of see the broader picture sometimes. You know, we have limited minds, we have limited perspective, and so sometimes it can feel like everything's closing in and we can't escape, you know, that we don't have any options, that we don't have any opportunity, but we do. And so the Surosia is a ritual that I think can be done to kind of remind us of that opportunity, to remind us of scope, the existence of scope. So the Surosia is a ritual of recommitment in the Ethereum, and is necessary for the regular recommissioning of the analytic mission. So what I mean by that is that the Surosia works both on the individual level and on the human levels, the sort of species level. It is a recommitment of the self to transcension, and it's also the recommissioning of transcension. Okay, transcension has existed for thousands of years, and it's been started and stopped, even persecuted in different times. And you can look at that in terms of the Astronic religious tradition. So if you go and take a look at all the persecutions that have taken place of even sort of scientific thinkers like Galileo, you know, I interpret that as a kind of persecution of transcension, really, halting the transcension. And what the Surosia wants to do is to continually recommission transcension, to continually bring it back, to remind us of transcension. Okay, so then it's not, so then it doesn't stop, you know, so then it doesn't so then it doesn't halt, so that it doesn't stop. And obviously I've referred to transcension there as the analytic mission. Okay, this is a mission that we have to do in order to achieve salvation, in order to free ourselves from limitation. So the Surosia works against the controversion. It's essentially bringing about opportunity, scope, and it's a literal invocation of scope from the divine. Okay, so there is that, very much that element of the Surosia that is about divine intervenience, for example, about actually invoking the divine at this stage for the purposes of receiving scope. So obviously, once you've attended a Surosian service, once you've received that scope, then comes the stage of promulgation. So to promulgate that scope, to spread the transcension with a heart and mind refilled with scope, astronality, and afflation. So of course, scope is the opportunities we have around us to progress transcension. Astronality is that sort of feeling inside us that allows us to connect to the astronomical world as the source of scope, or as the intermediary, of scope. The divine is the source of scope. The astronomical world is the intermediary of scope. Okay, so astronality allows us to do that. It's that aspect of our sapient person that allows us to receive scope. And then afflation is the knowledge, it's the sort of abilities, it's the capacities we have as a result of our scope. Okay, so it's For example, you know, when I was going through the development of the Omnidoxy, and I was receiving astral ecstasies and going through all that time, I was receiving afflation at that stage. And afflation is knowledge of transcension, essentially. And so that's what the Omnidoxy is. That's what the Astrodoxy is. That's what this is, essentially. This lecture is all about afflation. It's the sharing of that knowledge. It's receiving the knowledge and sharing it with others. And that's that promulgation stage, okay? So that follows on from the Surosia, and then once the promulgation stage has been initiated, we then move on to the Suronization stage, which actually shows a progression of transcension as a result of the Surosia and the promulgation. Okay, so the Suronization is that gradual progression of transcension, that the progress that we see in transcension as a result of our recommitment to transcension through the Surosia, and then also our promulgation of the scope that we've received during the Surosia and the afflation that we've received as well. Okay, so the Suronization shows the function of the Surosia in the economy of transcension. Okay, and it's all about gradually suppressing the limited parts of the self. And that's what I was trying to get to earlier when I was talking about those 3 different stages of scope, that we have this thing kind of pressing down on us, this limitation all the time pressing down on us. We have to try and suppress that. We have to try and overcome that. We have to try and supersede that in every part of our lives, in everything we do. Okay, and that's what the transcension is. And the Surosia, of course, Astronism helps us do that. The methods in Astronism, the techniques, the philosophy of Astronism helps us do that. Okay, so we've got this progression of transcension, but then sadly, the controversion returns, because we live in a limited world and it's our reality. It's our natural limited reality. We cannot escape that at this immediate stage. So even though there will be progressions in transcension as a result of the Surosia, and obviously we call that Suronization, those kind of progressions, the controversion will return, because it's the natural part of us. It is a part of us that cannot be taken out of us until transcension is completed, of course. So that's why we need the Surosia again, to recommit ourselves to transcension and to recommission the analytic mission, to kind of remind us of the importance of transcension. Okay, so that's why it's kind of got that circular function there, that kind of circular path, and that's why I call it the Surosian rhythm, because it kind of follows this rhythm of, you know, this limitation. Surosia reminds us of scope, and we can invoke scope through the Surosia. We spread that scope out, it progresses transcension, but then the rhythm comes back, and it sort of comes back to that limitation again that we need to try and suppress and overcome. Okay, so I think that's a really good kind of diagram to use to kind of understand the Surosia and its function in transcension. Okay, so the Surosian rhythm really describes the innate human tendency to kind of be led away from transcension due to cosmic limitation. And so the Surosia wants to kind of keep us with transcension. It doesn't want us to be led away from it. It doesn't want us to procrastinate away or to be averted away from transcension. It wants us to be close to transcension. It wants to remind us of transcension. It wants us to be close to transcension, that transcension is something that is part of our lives, that it's something that is important to us, okay, as part of our life meaning, of course, especially for Astronists. So that's the function of the Surosia at that kind of individual level. You know, there's this natural aversion to transcension, and therefore this necessitates a need for the regular re-establishment of transcension. We have to keep doing this. You could compare it somewhat in that sense to like the Catholic Mass, for example. You know, the Catholic Mass is not just to remind us of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's also, from the Catholic perspective, a way of literally manifesting that sacrifice. And that's something similar to what Surosia is trying to do. It does have a function, is what I mean. It does have a function in the world, and especially in the economy of transcension. It's recommissioning transcension, and it's reminding us of transcension. It's literally manifesting scope through this ritual, okay? So scope naturally flows from the divine through to the cosmos, which means it is then limited down to receptive sapient species, and so there exists uninstigated scope and summoned scope. Okay. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that scope is all around us naturally, and this is what I call natural scope or uninstigated scope. So this is scope that we haven't necessarily done anything to receive. We just receive it as a kind of natural flow through the astronomical world of divine sort of favor, but also of this opportunity really that exists. Whereas summoned scope is scope that is invoked, that something's been done in order to bring about that scope, that human beings have actually done something. And of course, one of the ways of bringing about that scope is through the Surosian ritual. Okay. So, the Surosia ritual is essentially invoking divine intervenience because scope is derived from God as the ultimate divinical source. Astronality, as I've said, is the faculty through which astronists accumulate their scope. So this is this element within us, this aspect of human nature, this aspect of human perception, really, that's able to receive scope from the astronomical world. Okay, that flows through the astronomical world as the intermediary of scope, as the intermediary between humanity and divinity. And that's why Astronism is a space religion, because it sees the astronomical world as that intermediary between humanity and divinity. Okay. The divine's dispensation of scope through the astronomical world to members of sapient species and their reception of this scope is the primary interaction between humanity and divinity and the Astronist religion. Okay, I think that's really important to kind of understand that this is the main way that we interact with the divine. Okay, as Astronists, we interact with the divine through our reception of scope, and then we manifest that scope, or we should do, in the world to progress transcension. Okay, this is how it functions. This is, hopefully you can, at this point you can see how the Astronist religion kind of functions, and particularly regarding transcension. Okay, so this interaction is solely analipsocentric, so it's transcension oriented. We interact with the divine for the sole purpose of bringing about the transcension. Okay, there's no other reason why the divine interacts with us. Okay, that's the only reason, so then we can return to the divine one day. Okay, so it's transcension oriented because it was established by the divine for the purpose of seeing transcension to fruition. This sort of intervenience, this sort of connection between humanity, astronomical world, and divinity was obviously established by the divine to bring about transcension. And that's why the interactions between astronists and the divine are seen as analipsocentric. Okay, again, it places the emphasis not necessarily on God, but actually on this process of becoming one with God. Okay, which makes Astronism more of a sort of analipsocentric religion, but also a cosmocentric religion, in the sense that there is a lot of emphasis placed on the sort of realities of the cosmos and how they limit us or stop us from directly engaging with the divine. So there's a lot of emphasis placed on these sort of analipsocentric, cosmocentric aspects of existence in Astronist philosophy, more so than in Christian philosophy, in the sense that, you know, Christianity is more theocentric. You know, it's more about that direct relationship with God. Whereas, yeah, Astronists can have a relationship with God, but it has to be through the astronomical world because of the cosmology, because of our limitedness. We cannot directly interact with divinity because we are so limited, you know. And so there is more of an emphasis placed on, well, how do we overcome those limitations? And that's what the Astronist religion is all about, really. So the divine-human relationship is focused on transcension, okay? So the Surosia, really, I mean, I've not spoken so far about what the actual Surosia is, in the sense of, okay, we know it's a ritual, but I've not spoken, and I don't think I will really speak about the actual each stage of the Surosia in detail, because I'm going to leave that for the Astrodoxy. What I want to just achieve in this lecture is just to establish that, yes, there is this central Astronist ritual. Yes, it's about invoking scope. It's about invoking that divine intervenience. But of course, you know, once the Astrodoxy is published, then there will be a lot more information about the Surosia. There will be a lot more detail on every aspect of the Surosia. I think at this stage, though, I think, you know, with the way that the Surosia is developing in the Astrodoxy, there seems to be more of a kind of liturgical aspect to the Surosia. But I think also there is, only because I understand the Surosia to be a little bit like the Mass, you know, like the Christian Mass or the Catholic Mass. That it's a place where Astronists can come together. It's a ritual that is performed in community with others. There's a lot of different aspects to it. But if you kind of take all that away, the Surosia could, in theory, be performed by anyone, really. I'm just thinking back to sort of those early days of Christianity, really, when the Mass was just getting started. I'm sure there were instances where, you know, the Mass was performed very informally, really, you know, not with all the sort of pomp and circumstance that we find in the Mass today. Maybe that wasn't the right word to use, pomp and circumstance, but you know what I mean, that kind of liturgical, that sort of very definitive and liturgical sort of aspect of the Mass. I think that, you know, it's the same for the Surosia. I think that it will start off in that very informal way, and I think it's going to be part of my role for the rest of my life, to try and institute the Surosia, to try and make that a tradition among Astronists, really. But I think it will, in a sense, be kind of, well, informal at the beginning. You know, it could be conducted just by one person. It's about essentially invoking this divine intervenience. And as we come here to the functions of the Surosia on the screen now, that is the first function that I've referred to, isn't it? By divine intervenience. You know, the performance of the Surosia initiates that sort of rebestowal of the confirmance of scope, afflation, and astronality. So it's about invoking divine intervenience in order to receive scope, essentially, in order to receive afflation, astronality, etc., etc. So this can be described as a kind of rescopement. I refer to that word as a kind of rescopement, this kind of bestowing scope again kind of idea. And this allows for sapient species to actively invoke and receive scope for the divine upon the practice of the Surosia, as the ritual endowed with the power to instigate scope. Okay, so there's a lot of emphasis here placed on this, the power of the Surosia to instigate that scope, to have that divine function, I suppose. which is probably similar to sort of the Catholic Mass again. You know, there is a sort of divine function in the Mass, isn't there, of course? And so the Surosia does have that same function to it. There has to be some kind of function of sort of invocation of scope of some kind for the Surosia to have any function in the economy of transcension, to progress transcension along. So we've got the recommitment of the individual person to transcension and to progress their own astrosis as well. So we're all on the journey to astrosis. Some of us will get there, some of us won't. The Surosia is a way of us to recommit ourselves to transcension. It's the way that we can recommit as individuals to our own Surosia, to our own astrosis, sorry. It's about recommissioning the scope for recommissioning transcension for the twilight-eyed. So in Astronism, we await what we call the twilight-eyed, which is where humanity will choose either between transcension or controversion. And the Surosia is about kind of constantly recommissioning the transcension, reminding us of transcension in order so that human beings will choose transcension when the period of the twilight-eyed comes. The Surosia's manifestation of scope actively counteracts both the controversion and the degradation. I spoke about that in the previous slide on the Surosian rhythm, sorry. And then, of course, the Surosia also works as a special function in the Sidereal economy. I spoke about this many times in this lecture so far. You know, this idea that the Surosia, well, because scope is so central to the functioning of the Sidereal economy, it's the currency of transcension, really. Scope is the currency of transcension. And so because it is so central to transcension, we need as much of it as we can, you know, and because the Surosia is one of the ways that we can invoke scope, that means that it serves a very important function in the broader economy of transcension. Okay. I think there's also this element as well that's really important, this kind of relationship, I would say, actually, between the Surosia and the Siderinium. So the Siderinium is the kind of covenant well, it's called the covenant of transcension. It's the oath that an Astronist makes in their commitment to transcension, essentially. And I entered into this covenant with the divine in my institution of the transcension, in my development of Astronism, of course, and this is called the Siderinium, this covenant. This is the agreement that I made, my commitment to bringing about transcension, and this, of course, is what also Astronists are committed to. When they become Astronists, they're committed to leading the transcension of humanity. Okay, so the Siderinium is what siderinically, I know I'm using that word a lot, but is what siderinically, meaning in terms of transcension, links humanity to divinity. Okay, so in terms of the economy of transcension. So the Siderinium as the covenant of transcension links humanity to divinity to have an effect on the economy of transcension. Okay, so the completion of transcension shall bring to fruition the Siderine covenant, the Siderinium. Okay, so in our completion of transcension, the Siderine covenant will then be will then come to fruition, as I've said, or will be complete itself. It will be fulfilled. Okay, when a person experiences the Astronaira, they enter into this same covenant with divinity. So this is at the beginning of the Astronist journey. When someone is becoming an Astronist, we call their sort of first experience of astronality, we call it Astronaira, or Astronira is another way of pronouncing that word. And this again allows that person to enter into this covenant with divinity, this kind of a commitment, this kind of oath to complete transcension. Okay. And this actualizes in our personal astrosis, but also in the contributions we make to the transcension of humanity as a whole. Okay, so there is this link, this very strong link, this very strong connection between the Surosia and the Sidereunium. The Surosia is the ritual, the Sidereunium is the covenant, is the oath that we make to further transcension, to complete transcension, and we need that ritual, that Surosia, to do that. We need that ritual to complete transcension, okay? So just to kind of go in again on this a little bit deeper, really, on on the role of the Surosia in the Siderean economy, it functions by the movement of scope from its divine source down through either the astronomical world or the overworld to humanity to allow for the progression of transcension. Okay, so the Surosia, in invoking scope from the divine, in sort of invoking that divine intervenience, it's moving scope from the divine through the astronomical world down to us here, us as human beings, as a sapient species. Okay. Two things to note there is that this could be happening, and hopefully is happening with other sapient species in the cosmos, because obviously Astronism is a extraterrestrial affirming religion in the sense that we believe that there are other sapient species out there that also may invoke scope for themselves. So it's not just limited to humanity, of course. So that's the first point to make here. And then the second point there, you'll see that scope can either come through the sort of physical astronomical world, or it can come through the metaphysical astronomical world, which is what I call the overworld. I spoke about this in the Astronism versus Christianity lecture, particularly regarding the eschatology of Astronism. The fact that scope can come through the overworld means that we can actually connect to those, our ancestors, to people, to souls and consciousnesses that have deceased. We can connect to those and bring about scope through them. Okay, so we can do that in two ways. We can either do it through astronality, or we can do it through this kind of astral mediumship, if you will, this kind of astral connection back to the souls of the dead, okay, the spirits of the dead. So there is sort of those two aspects there, that kind of metaphysical, which is the overworld, and then the physical, which is the astronomical world. We both receive scope through those, but we can choose which or how we do go about that. Okay, so then we come on to this sort of function again of the Siderean economy, and particularly the Surosia's function in that economy. So the Surosia functions to instigate scope. It is the active participation, really, of a sapient species in invoking scope. Besides scope's natural dispensation through the astronomical world, which I've already spoken about, that kind of distinction between natural scope and summoned scope, okay? And then also you've got this idea that the Surosia fulfills the sidereunical function of bringing about greater levels of scope for the human species. This equates to a greater probability to achieve transcension, which is, of course, the ultimate goal of performing the Surosia. Okay, so the Surosia work, how does it work? Well, it's going to be a ritual. It's also going to be a service when it's formally established. It's not being sort of formally, well, you could say maybe now it's going to be formally established through this lecture, but I think once the Astrodoxy is published and there's sort of a lot more details come out about the Surosia, at that point, I'll then be able to make the announcement that it is formally established. But it is a ritual and it is a service, and it must be performed in the prescribed way in order to possess the necessary function of invoking scope, so that the scope in question may be received. So that's why I was saying earlier about this distinction between kind of Surosia and, you know, other kind of forms of Astronist practice in a way. The Surosia has to be done in a particular way. It has to be done using the particular language and words in order for it to have that effect, which distinguishes it from sort of general other Astronist practices. Okay. That's why I think it's important to always make that distinction. So it's the Central Astronist Service, and it's the Astronist equivalent to the Catholic Mass, and I've spoke about that already so far today. So the Surosia opens up the human mind to greater receptivity to the natural scope, as well as actively invokes new scope through divine intervenience. So it has those dual functions there, doesn't it? It's bringing about greater receptivity to the scope that already is around us, but it's also invoking new scope as well. Okay. So it works in that kind of dual function, which I think is really interesting. And also the Surosia works at both the individual, sidereal, and specific levels for analytic purposes. So purposes of progressing transcension. So what I mean by that is that the Surosia works at the individual level for you as a person, no matter who you are, whether you're an Astronist or a non-Astronist. It works at the sidereal level, which refers more to Astronists, you know, people who've actually committed to the sidereal, who've actually become Astronists and are part of that covenant of transcension. And then it also works at the specific level. And what I mean by that is I use that word specific to refer to species. So it works at that species-wide level, that obviously brings about transcension as a collective species. Okay, so hopefully you've got that sort of general outline there of the Surosia, its functions, how it, why and how it functions, and why it's important, why I think it needs to be instituted, and why I will be instituting it as part of Astronist practice, following its sort of formal establishment through the Astrodoxy, really. And obviously at that point I'll then be able to do, you know, a brand new video actually exploring the contents of the Surosia. But I think it's good at this stage to kind of establish that yes, there is this central Astronist ritual, just because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, you know, there was this sort of non-ritual or even in parts anti-ritual approach that I'd had to Astronism during the development of the Omnidoxy. And so I just wanted to kind of, before the Astrodoxy is published, I think it was important to kind of show that there's been a slight change in that, and that now that transcension is much more of a formulated doctrine, there has now come a time for the function of a ritual. This ritual, of course, is very astronistic. It's very much to do with transcension, of course, but you know, it is ultimately about divine intervenience. It is ultimately about bringing that relationship between humanity and divinity closer through scope, through the astronomical world, through transcension. Okay, so I hope you guys are sort of looking forward to sort of learning more about the actual contents of the Surosia, but by that time, you know, you'll have a really good idea about what the functions of that ritual are, why it needs to be established, and sort of its role in sort of broader astronism as well. Okay, so thank you for listening. Again, you know that there's a few books here that there's one published, or a couple published actually last year, the main one being the Astronist statement. Go and take a look at that if you've not managed to take a look at it already. Take a look at some of those key websites, I think, as well, because they are really good resources. They can also be used as references as well, you know, if you're referring to sort of any Astronist sort of beliefs or ideas, you know, you can use those websites as well as resources. And also as well, you know, I'm going to be trying to publish the Astronist system book, which is, as it says on the front cover there, a precursor to the Astrodoxy. So this will try to introduce some of these doctrines that have emerged sort of in the interdoxical period, but also in the astrodoxical period as well. It's just trying to kind of keep up with all these changes that are taking place in the Astronist religion at this present time. So I think it was just really important today in this lecture to kind of get across that, you know, things are changing. Astronism is a new religion. It is constantly changing. Not major things, you know, some of the basic things are still there and they'll always be there, hopefully. But you know, there are other changes taking place, and the Surosia is one example of that, where earlier on I was more kind of anti-ritual and sort of saw rituals as being a bit outdated, but now I think with this Surosia having emerged in my writings, you know, it's shown me that there is a place for ritual in astronism, and it's very analypsocentric, so it's very transcension oriented ritual, but it has a very important function, I think, in astronism and in the goals of astronism. Okay, so thanks everyone for listening, and I will see you in the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan. So see you later, guys.